Funding for New Mexico in Focus is provided by viewers like you.
This week on New Mexico in Focus, we follow up with Senate President Pro Tem Mimi Stewart after her signature climate bill failed yet again this year as we tie up loose ends from the Roundhouse. Plus,
when we're not sort of valuing and appreciating these lives, then their deaths are less consequential. And again, because they are, we don't highlight the fact that these disparities exist.
New research shows black women in the U.S. are 4 times more likely to be killed than white women. We hear about the factors underlying this reality and the risks of ignoring it. New Mexico in Focus starts now. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nash Jones. Last year, we brought you a story of Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham sending National Guard troops to Albuquerque's International District and how it differed from President Trump's non-consensual deployments elsewhere in the country. Well, they have now left, and tonight we are going to get an update from the area's city councilor, Nicole Rogers, on how that operation went and why it fell short of its goals. Before we get there, though, correspondent Russell Contreras sits down with UNM Associate Professor Tamika Gillum to learn about her new research and the staggering disparities it uncovered about the killing of black women in the U.S. Dr. Gillum breaks down what she and her team found, why it's a public health crisis, and what it reveals about the structural barriers and unique vulnerability of black women in our country. Later, we welcome the return of Indigenously Positive. That's our collaboration with nonprofit news outlet New Mexico in Depth, celebrating Native joy and achievement. To kick off season 2, Bella Davis and the Indigenously Positive team take you to a classroom on Santa Clara Pueblo, where kids are seeing themselves and connecting to their science lessons on a whole new level. They're using Native knowledge and cultural practices to learn the concepts. But we begin the show with Capital and Maine journalist Jerry Redfern, who is back to wrap up his series on oil and gas legislation from the session. You have heard about the Clear Horizons Act before on this show. It's a bill that would have made permanent the governor's climate goals before she leaves office at the end of the year. Well, it failed again. So tonight, Jerry hashes out what happened with its sponsor, Democratic Senator Mimi Stewart, and what it means for New Mexico's future.
Senator Stewart, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Jerry.
Well, it's great. So let's just jump right into this. Let's talk about one of the biggest bills of this past session, the bill that you carried, the Clear Horizons Act. Can you give us an idea in a nutshell what that was about and then what happened to it?
So the Clear Horizons Act was an attempt to put into our statutes the executive order that our governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, put into place her first month in office in 2019, she set out an executive order that asked her state agencies to work on climate mitigation. New Mexico is part of the Southwest. We're hot and dry, and with climate change, we're going to get hotter and drier. We're in a pretty profound drought right now. New Mexico is one of 7 states that share the Colorado River through a compact. That compact has ended now without a good resolution of what we do moving forward. I believe the governor was a visionary when she came here, knowing that she had to work on climate change. And so her state agencies did that. 3 of them now have climate bureaus. We have a sustainable economy task force that rests in the Economic Development Department. When we set up the Economic Development Department, our intent was to diversify our economy, and that's what that task force is supposed to do. So the Clear Horizons Act put the governor's greenhouse gas limits into statute and then defined greenhouse gas and a statewide greenhouse gas emissions measurement in the bill. And then it's set up to have rulemaking by our Environmental Improvement Board. They do an incredible job of stakeholder meetings, looking at evidence, and then to monitor and measure our reduction of greenhouse gases. That's essentially the bill.
Okay, so we had a bill that came in trying to do all of these things, reducing greenhouse gases. But what happened? I mean, what happened with the bill?
Well, the bill died on the Senate floor. I could only lose 5 votes, and I lost 7. So it went through the Conservation Committee and passed out pretty much party line. It went through Tax and Rev, Tax, Business, and Transportation in the Senate, and it came out pretty much party line. And then it got to the floor, and the other side started picking people off and scaring them and doing little memes and putting their picture and don't vote for this bill up on the social internet. I mean, they just, and of course, I was pilloried every night on TV. Apparently, I'm just the worst thing for kids around.
So just to clarify, this was 7 Democrats who voted against the bill,
Yes.
where previously in committee hearings it had been pretty much party line vote all
That's
the way
right.
along.
That's right.
So why, I mean, there's scare tactics in social media posts, but why do you think those Democrats actually voted against it?
You know, I think some people think that it would mean less revenue from oil and gas. But none of the things we've done the last 7 years, being fully underneath the executive order of the governor, has changed any of that oil and gas. In fact, oil and gas production has doubled under the methane rules, the ETA, which is tangential but still part of it, under the Clean Cars rules,
Energy Transition Act.
Energy Transition Act, and the Clean Fuels Bill. We've done all of those in the last 7 years. Production has doubled. We can't really look like we can scale things back with oil and gas. They're just trying to get as much oil out of that ground as they can for their stakeholders. They're making billions of dollars. We just want them to clean it up at the wellhead. No more venting of methane and lowering your greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. So part of what you had in the bill was this idea of carbon offsets, right?
Yes.
Which, when you and I spoke before the session began for an article I did at Capital Maine, you said that actually the industry came to you with this idea to add that in.
We met with the industry, showed them an outline of the bill. We weren't done with it yet. And there are a number of things they did not like in the bill, as you can imagine. They just prefer not to be regulated. Although they're part of national, global organizations that are trying to regulate emissions, greenhouse gases, they're all part of those national organizations. So they talked at length about some of the issues for them. And when they talked about having a little more flexibility for offsets for carbon emission decrease, I decided to do that in the bill.
So do you think, well, let me put it this way. When there were the debates then, when they were happening, when there were actual debates during the committee sessions, I heard from anybody who was there, heard from lobbyists from the oil and gas industry then decrying that this bill was the end of the world. They were saying, people are going to just roll up shop and take off. Why do you think that they would both talk to you about, hey, let's put these carbon offsets in the bill, but then at the same time come to you during these committee hearings and say this is the worst thing ever, and then have these Democrats vote against it? How do you balance those two ideas there?
Well, it's very hard to balance it, and it's really kind of makes my heart sick. In Hawaii, they all work together, all the Democrats, all the Republicans, all the chambers, the industry, everyone. Lowered their greenhouse gas emission, put essentially the same targets in their statutes that we tried to do, and then they had a big party at the end of it. In Colorado, they have passed essentially the same standards as we have, with requirements to lower emissions, and they've passed their bill instead of what's happened in New Mexico. So I just think somebody is lying about these issues because, the head of NMOGA has been in the paper multiple times saying how great the methane reduction was. We had to drag them kicking and screaming to those methane reduction rules. They finally agreed to it. And now, yes, they've lowered their emissions tremendously. We have been working for 7 years in this state to lower these greenhouse gas emissions. Ag is already there for their 2030 target. We're doing better in transportation with our clean fuels. So everybody needs to lower their greenhouse gas emissions if we want to have any impact on mitigating climate change in this state, because we're just looking at more fire, more floods, more devastation.
I'd like to ask you then, another regular comment that came up during the committee hearings was that, well, yes, New Mexico pollutes, and we have a big carbon emission, a lot of carbon emissions that come out of the state of New Mexico. But when you compare it to the rest of the world, it's really not that much. Why should we have to clean up at this sort of level that you're proposing here? Whereas, it always comes back to China. Why China doesn't have to do it? Why should we? I mean, what is the argument there?
China's already doing it. China is about to do more solar than coal for the first time. Their emissions are actually going down. Some people think we have the best oil in the world. It's called sweet oil. It doesn't need as much refinement as, say, the oil from Venezuela. So our oil is valuable, and other countries are actually wanting our oil and gas. Japan would like to buy our natural gas from us, but guess what they say? It has to be clean first. It can't be produced with methane spewing out into the air. It can't have a high emission, greenhouse gas emission, or we won't buy it. Remember how we got Facebook and Los Lunas? They said, we want all renewable energy, and we gave them that. We created a solar field right there for them. They've increased the gross receipts to Los Lunas by 85%. So there are companies who want to be green and who want to move forward with this idea that industry needs to be cleaner.
So I just want to sort of bring this idea around. Tell me if this is what you're kind of getting at, that New Mexico theoretically produces this very, I'm reluctant to use the word, but clean oil and gas.
Well, I don't use that. We use sweet. That's
Sweet?
That's what you use, say, for the oil that comes out of the Permian Basin.
Well, that tends to be because it's low sulfur, but that's a different argument. We can talk about that later. That'll be fun. But the idea that you're bringing up here is that you had this Clear Horizons Act, which was essentially what these companies would need to be doing if they're going to be exporting the oil and gas from here, because that's the requirements coming from Europe and from Japan and other places. Do I have that pretty much straight?
Yes. Now, your first question was, we're small. Why should we care about this? We're small. We're the 5th largest state geographically, but we have the 2nd highest greenhouse gas emissions in the country after Texas. And we know where they are and who's doing it. And we've had an executive order for 7 years to try to rein in those greenhouse gas emissions, not to run off oil and gas, but to incentivize or regulate them so that they will lower those greenhouse gas emissions. Colorado is doing it. Other areas of the world are doing it. It can be done. These companies have a lot of innovation. In Colorado, they actually have machines at every well piece that sucks up the methane. I forget the name of it, but they've just done that this last year. So we think that it's important for the industry in New Mexico to rein in their pollution. We have a very high amount of asthma among our students. We have something like 140,000 people that live within a half a mile of an oil well.
So if that's the case, then what are you going to bring this bill back next year? And if so, how do you think you'll be changing it to make it more palatable, perhaps, to the 3 or 4 Democrats you'll need to flip next time, provided it makes it that far?
It's too soon for me to answer that question. I know what I want to keep doing. There's just an incredible coalition behind the Clear Horizons Act. The Samia Project, CVNM, all the environmental groups in the state. There's just a lot of work that's been done in our communities about the Clear Horizons Act. We had a group of people from Interfaith Power and Light from Carlsbad walk all the way to Santa Fe for the Clear Horizons Act. But I certainly want to continue to be involved with the coalition around the state that's grown over the last several years, try to rein in the greenhouse gas emissions that we're producing.
So, very last thing, and when you and I talked before the session began, I asked you, do you think that the way that the legislature is set up with these really quick sessions, you have legislators who are not paid, and it's really a very part-time job for the most part. You brought up that, by the last week of the session, everybody's running on fumes, but they're trying to think through these very difficult bills. And you said, but that's just the way that it is, and you can still get stuff, we still get stuff done. Bills still get passed, you can still get bills passed. Do you still feel that way, or do you think we're really heading to a point where we need to change things?
Well, I think we have, thank goodness, we have newer and younger people arriving in our legislature. They want to get paid for the work they're doing. This is my 32nd year.
Are you getting the hang of it?
I'm getting the hang of it, but I certainly haven't been paid for any of it. So I support them in doing that. And we passed a constitutional amendment to get legislators pay in the very last minute of the session. It goes to the voters now. I hope the voters understand how much work we all do for no pay. I think we would have, I don't know, I just don't know. All I've known is the citizen legislature and the short sessions, but the long, robust interim committee process where we just go into things in great detail. So, it might be time to modernize the legislature. We'll lose some of the fun, but we probably need to have a longer period of time and pay people so that people will take it more seriously.
Well, Senator Mamie Stewart, thank you so much. This has been great. I hope to see you back here again.
All right. Well, thank you, Jerry. Appreciate talking with you.
We did not use them to the full capacity and to the skills. The New Mexico National Guard is a statewide asset. And it's not about, the question isn't about should they serve or should they not serve. It's really about how do we deploy them strategically, effectively, humanely, so we meet the objective. But first we need to know what that objective is.
That interview with Albuquerque City Councilor Nicole Rogers is in less than 15 minutes. Last year, Dr. Tamika Gillum co-wrote a study published by the American Journal of Public Health that declared that the high rate of black women murdered in America is a public health crisis. That study examined more than 30,000 homicides between 1999 and 2020 and found a massive disparity in homicide rates between black and white women. An associate professor with the University of New Mexico, Dr. Gillum's work has been highlighted in recent years by The Guardian and the program In Black America from NPR. This week, she sits down with contributor Russell Contreras to discuss her findings and consider how structural racism has made life more dangerous for black women.
Dr. Tamika Gillum, thank you for joining us here on New Mexico in Focus.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
Your research found a staggering disparity in 2020, where black women were murdered at nearly 4 times the rates as white women. What does this disparity reveal about the broader and structural forces reshaping violence in the United States?
Yeah, well, it definitely speaks to the unique vulnerability of women of color in particular in terms of some of the structural barriers that are faced by communities of color, which facilitate things like high rates of poverty, racial segregation and redlining have placed African Americans in neighborhoods that experience significant rates of crime, rates of poverty, high police presence, struggles in terms of employment, underemployment, unemployment, All of these things, neighborhood disorganization, all of these things create circumstances that essentially make Black women more vulnerable to experiencing violence in multiple forms. In some places, that disparity is as high as 20 times as much. If you look at states like the state of Wisconsin, Black women experience homicide at a rate 20 times that of white women. And so, you know, that disparity varies significantly, but it's present essentially in any of these states.
Now, you've described the killing of Black women as a public health crisis. From a population health perspective, why is it important to use this lens when examining the 11.6 per 100,000 homicide rates for Black women?
Yeah, it's important because when you think about, I mean, this is something that is killing a significant portion of the population. And anytime we have any type of disparity in disease, for example, when it's acknowledged as a disparity, then there tends to be more resources allocated to trying to understand the problem more and try to address the problem. Once we do, we can better put ourselves in a position to better study, better understand, and better put into place resources that are beyond just temporary quick fixes, but hopefully things that get at some of the underlying factors that contribute to the violence that this community is experiencing and the unique vulnerability that Black women subsequently experience.
Now, in your review of the national mortality data, how often are these deaths misclassified, underreported, and are we potentially looking at numbers that are even higher than this 11.6 per 100,000 residents, this homicide?
We are definitely looking at the potential for undercounting in this respect. I mean, there's a lot of support for the contention that these deaths aren't necessarily always accurately captured, and that's especially the case with Black trans women. There's often issues in terms of misgendering, sometimes failure to sort of recognize these, especially as hate crimes that they often are. And so the reality is that we see these disparities, but it's very possible that the full magnitude of that is not fully understood in that respect.
The recent conviction of Sean Grayson in the killing of Sonia Massey has reignited a national conversation about police violence. How does the state-sanctioned violence, particularly police shootings, interest your broader findings of the killing of Black women in the United States?
Yeah, so in the sense of sort of this notion of state-sanctioned violence, I mean, you're talking about police officers going into communities, and Black communities tend to be over-policed, which essentially exposes Black communities to encounters with police more often. Where research supports that Black women are more likely to be stopped, more likely to be arrested, more likely to be on the receiving end of the use of force from police officers. And so it's not necessarily surprising then that Black women tend to experience higher rates of violence at the hands of police officers, including homicides, right? And the Sonia Massey case was an excellent prime example of that. And the sentencing was great, that we got some sense of accountability in that respect, because that has been lacking for a long time. But it's still very rare that these institutions are ever held accountable for the killing of Black women.
Now, here in New Mexico, we've had a lot of focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Yes.
What's the overlap that you see or you recognize between murdered Indigenous women and the murdering of Black women?
I do see a lot of overlap there, and the reality is that there has been limited attention that has been directed towards caring about and addressing the fact that both of our communities are experiencing significant violations of our women, to the point where some of those women are actually lost. So we experience higher rates of intimate partner violence, we experience higher rates of sexual assault, and we experience higher rates of murder. And there's a reason why our particular communities are experiencing those disparate rates. And so when you talk about communities that have had historically struggles in terms of being validated and appreciated by this country, that the murder and missing of of our women definitely is a manifestation of the fact that our women aren't cared about as much.
Historically, violence against black women have often received this limited, sustained media attention and policy attention. How does this invisibility shape our public understanding and the urgency of this response? I keep thinking of R. Kelly. It took us 15 years, almost 2 decades, to finally have some sort of reckoning about his behavior. Why are we not getting this attention with black women? What's stopping us?
When we're not sort of valuing and appreciating these lives, then their deaths are less consequential. And so we definitely need, and again, because they are, we don't highlight the fact that these disparities exist and not enough attention is being paid to trying to sort of rectify that. We don't receive the adequate attention, therefore the complexity of the problem is not understood. We still want to sort of deny the impacts that things like historical racism and how that has, to this day, generational trauma, disenfranchised positions, those things have continued to affect our communities generation after generation.
Recently, a Mississippi-based civil rights group released a report that says that there are about a dozen of alleged modern-day lynchings across the southern states. And most of these deaths have been classified as either unsolved or suicides. Without speculating on any of these cases, what kind of questions should researchers and public health officials be asking about these cases?
We should be asking what the real question is, and what we should really have a reckoning with our, historical racism and how that still is manifesting in multiple forms today. I mean, unfortunately, there are people who thought things like groups like hate groups, white supremacist groups, etc. There are folks who honestly thought these groups were gone, right? But they were never actually gone. They kind of went underground, and we saw a resurgence of them from the time that President Obama essentially was elected, and we started seeing, those groups, those actions again, sort of come to the surface, unfortunately. And when you don't have, when those types of groups and actors and crimes aren't properly acknowledged as hate crimes, as aren't fully recognized in the way that they should be, then these things are allowed to continue to happen, because now there's a resurgence and proliferation of those hate groups, that hate speech, and it's not being properly condemned. So it's just sort of growing and manifesting, and people are, now being more bold and blatant about these types of killings, essentially.
If we were to look at this data with black women and the murdering of black women 5 or 10 years from now, what do you hope you would see? What would progress look like, and how do we achieve that?
I would definitely, in general, like to see the murder of women overall decline, but I certainly want to see those disparities narrow, right? When you're talking about, an average of, 4 times as many black women being murdered, that should indicate a significant problem structurally. And so when we think about, some of the legislation, Minnesota is essentially the first and the only state that has a missing and murdered African American women task force. Similar legislation has been presented at the national level and resisted, and I doubt that will pass anytime soon. And other states such as Wisconsin has put forth similar legislation, but again, that has stalled as well. So certainly 5-10 years from now, again, I would like to see the national legislation pass that has been put forth, and I would like to see those task force and those resources being enacted in states, and true efforts to get at some of the things like the disproportionate poverty that African American communities experience, a lot of the disenfranchised conditions in the neighborhoods that facilitate over-policing, things like this. And so certainly our police forces need better training and accountability in terms of being able to be more culturally aware, to even better understanding things like how to engage with people with mental illness or in distress, or recognizing hidden biases, having those different types of trainings and awareness for agencies like police, but also then having those national and state policies that put resources into recognizing this problem and properly addressing it, again, in a more structural way.
Dr. Tamika Gillum, thank you for joining us here on New Mexico in Focus.
Thank you again for having me. I appreciate it.
What I feel Indigenous science is it's the teachings. And it starts from the ancestors, in terms of being scientists and with astronomy and with connection to the land and pottery making, the arts, all of that are examples of Indigenous science. So when I look at what we're doing, I feel like it's reinforcing a lot of what they're getting at home and within their community.
Bella Davis shares those stories in the latest installment of Indigenously Positive in about 15 minutes. And thanks to Russell Contreras and Professor Gillum for their conversation. For a few more months, the New Mexico National Guard is assisting local police in Española. It's the latest in a series of deployments around the state to assist with public safety. And there's talk of sending soldiers to Gallup now, too. We covered the governor's plan to use the Guard last year, starting with their assignment in Albuquerque along Central Avenue in the city's International District. Over a period of 60 days, the Guard worked with APD to, as the governor's office put it, address immediate quality of life concerns for people living in that area, while, quote, working towards long-term solutions to the city's most pressing public safety concerns. Now, a few months after the Guard packed up and left town, we are getting a clearer picture of whether the operation succeeded. The leader of the Guard, Major General Miguel Aguilar, told state lawmakers late last month that the mission wasn't going to have the impact that officials had hoped. To understand why, senior producer Lou DeVizio sat down with City Councilor Nicole Rogers. She represents District 6, home to much of the area where the Guard was deployed. She tells Lou that to find solutions for her district, we need to first better understand the structural issues standing in the way.
City Councilor Nicole Rogers, great to see you again, and thanks for coming back again to New Mexico in Focus.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Now, the National Guard left Albuquerque at the end of last year after spending months along Central Avenue, largely in District 6, your district. What did you see during the time that they were deployed?
Yeah, I definitely kept a close eye on what was happening really real time on the ground. We had our National Guard members in our real-time crime center monitoring our camera system. We had them, I saw them at platforms for our transit areas, like on Central, specifically the Central Corridor. And then also I would see them kind of holding perimeter during large events that we would have in our district, whether it was a SWAT activation or a crash or a fire or something like that. They were really the ones keeping the perimeter. And that's basically what I saw them doing.
Okay. Did you hear any feedback from your constituents during the time that they were there?
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the deployment or the news of the deployment, people were really unsure what the objective was, what's the purpose, what are we trying to achieve. And then as it went along, kind of just became a normal part of our policing, really, just the normal, status quo of policing. So I didn't hear a whole lot of backlash or people, kind of saying they shouldn't be here or shouldn't be serving in this way.
Now, before we get to what the National Guard leader in charge of that operation had to say about it, what was your understanding of what that objective was before they came?
Yeah, I think that was something I asked for clarification on early on. Seeing the chief's letter that went to the governor and the list of things that he asked for, I was really interested in the humanitarian portion of that. And public safety is more than just policing, so I thought it was a really great opportunity to actually connect folks to help and as well as policing. And so I just wanted to know in practice, how is it actually going to work? What are we training them on? What's our objective? What are we going to be actually using them for? Which I don't think was as clear based on the list. In practice, what are we actually going to do?
Right.
Yeah.
In January, Major General Miguel Aguilar spoke to state lawmakers on the Senate Judiciary about the deployment. Here's what he had to say.
What you had over about an 8-week period was a stress test to the criminal justice system as well documented, I think, as I've ever seen. What we came to realize is that Absent structural change, current outcomes are predictable and they're self-sustaining. And so, and that was what we found in the operation is no matter what we did from a criminal enforcement perspective, the environment didn't really change much.
Do you agree that there are structural problems creating crime for people in your district? And if you do, what are they?
Yeah, I think structurally we cannot police our way out of this only. So I think what was missing from the Albuquerque deployment, I think, was a clear objective to what it is we were wanting to do. If we look at places that they've been deployed since, like Espanola, right, there was a clear objective to go after violent crime and substance abuse mitigation to make sure folks weren't overdosing, right? So harm reduction. That was missing from our deployment, right? And so I asked before, during, and even after, the objective was not clear, and I think that's why Major General maybe feels that way, that we did not use them to the full capacity and to the skills. The New Mexico National Guard is a statewide asset. And it's not about, the question isn't about should they serve or should they not serve. It's really about how do we deploy them strategically, effectively, humanely, so we meet the objective. But first we need to know what that objective is.
Right. Now, a lot of his testimony and his statements to lawmakers were focused on crime specifically, and he shared some data, around 1,000 arrests along Central during the nearly 2-month stretch. The largest chunk of those arrests, about 40%, were arrested for what he called public order crimes, nearly 30% for drug offenses, and just short of 20% on violent crimes. The rest were property crimes, a smaller number. He says about 80% of the people that were arrested, though, were released and on pretrial conditions, and half were released completely within 48 hours. I have a lot of questions about those numbers and the focus of that operation still, but let's start with that assertion that releasing people ahead of trial is maybe the most significant systemic issue that he couldn't work around. Where do you stand on pretrial detention and the so-called revolving doors influence on safety in your district?
Where I stand on it is I think that there needs to be there's already clear processes in our judicial system to render somebody incompetent to stand trial, right? And so I think what we're doing in the legislature is making those a little bit more robust, and to say that if you are not competent to stand trial, then another evaluation needs to be done to see if you're competent to be released on your own recognizance. Because for probably between 600 and 800 folks in my district that are severely mentally ill, they're not going to be able to make that decision for themselves. They're not of sound mind. And I think that's, but I know one thing from the community, they don't want law enforcement to be making that decision, right? So if they are doing things that are harm to themselves or others, then law enforcement should step in, and then we should meet them with the mental health resources that they need to be able to make a better decision for themselves. So policing is not going to fix this, but we have to couple them both, and I think that's why we're seeing much more success. But it's the same laws in Espanola statewide that are in Albuquerque, right? But again, the objective is clear, and we're working on that, and I think it's showing much better outcomes.
Right. How much say did you have before the National Guard came to your district, and would you have liked more?
Absolutely. I think that's one thing I was vocal about. Let's be real though, the governor and the mayor don't need my permission to do what they did. I believe that both of them were trying to do what they could within their power to do something transformational for my district. But as the leader that's most impacted, I was not listened to. I asked several times in meetings with Major General, with the governor, with mayor, asking specifically for what I know my community needs. And so I don't feel like I was listened to. I do hope that if we try this again, we can take what we learned from Albuquerque and other areas. But I live on Wyoming and Central. I am the most impacted, and I really do know what my community needs. And it's both. It's the public safety, but it's also utilizing the National Guard for the skills that they're good at, which is logistics, coordination, neighborhood stabilization, and that's what I need, and that's public safety. Instead of just thinking about policing, we missed the boat, and thinking of the broader public safety and how could National Guard have utilized them to their full potential of the skills that they already possess.
Okay, so was the failure in your mind then in planning this whole thing or the execution of the operation?
I can't speak to planning because I wasn't involved in the conversations leading up to them coming. But I know for sure, leadership here. I didn't see the type of leadership I'd like to have seen that I was asking for when it came to strategic objective, so that we know what we're trying to do, and then bringing the best beautiful minds in the room from all jurisdictions to figure out how to execute to make sure we meet our objective. It's a multi-pronged approach. So systematically, like you mentioned, we have to do the changing of the laws in the state legislature, which I think we're on the way to that. The governor should be signing that bill soon. I think we need resources put into mental health. So I'm asking folks like UNM Hospital, UNM HSC, to expand the programs that are in there, like their alcohol and substance abuse program that has amazing outcomes, but again, they haven't expanded that program, right? The street medicine, we need those resources to be expanded. We need places for, okay, if we have civil commitment, where are they gonna go? Right? We don't have the infrastructure in this state to house folks in that way right now and give them the humane care that they deserve. So that's another systematic. But the biggest thing I don't think anybody's talking about is poverty alleviation strategies. The bottom line is, if you are addicted to something and you have the means to get help, you can pay for that help and you can get that help. If you don't and you're on Medicaid, the waiting list to get into a substance abuse program is very long. So we have to be looking at poverty. In New Mexico, it's also generational poverty. They don't have that line, that helpline, that lifeline in their own family to help with issues. So poverty also is a systematic change that we have to begin to think about.
Okay. Through that multi-pronged approach, obviously a lot of those issues are long-term issues that would take long-term fixes. What do you say to those that would argue that the long-term fixes aren't feasible until the short-term issue of crime is fixed? And how should that be approached all at once? Do you think that there's a holistic strategy going on in the mind of our state lawmakers, city leaders?
I'm not sure. I think that's a really good question. I think what my heart tells me is that we're thinking of this as a linear approach. And when you recited the numbers, we arrested 1,000 people. Did it help? Did it meet the objective? No, it didn't. And I think what I know of working with the governor for this, 2 years in my term, she wants results of the perception of public safety when she's driving down Central, right? And that what's driving the perception to make people feel like they're not safe in my neighborhood, right? And that's the suffering that we're seeing. And we need to look at it from that perspective, that these are folks, for whatever reason that they're there, they're suffering, right? And how do we, in the roles that we're in and with the immense amount of resources we have access to, how do we alleviate that suffering for folks? And sometimes that is law enforcement, that is going into jail, right? But if you're out in a day and a half, usually you need 3 days or 4 days to detox, right? So it used to be that jail was a place that you can connect to those resources and make a different decision for yourself because you were there long enough to be able to have those thoughts and get clarity of mind for a little bit. But that's not the case right now. So the judicial system, we have outpatient treatment, drug courts, we have lots of systems set up. But again, we don't have enough to cycle through the amount of people that need it. And so we just need to segment people based on what they need. And we know we have 600 plus folks that are severely mental health, that need those types of severe mental health services. Let's focus on those. I don't know that anybody is focusing on those, and that's the perception of safety when you don't have folks not in their right mind all over my community.
Okay. I just want to stay on perception for one more question here. What do folks miss who don't live in your district, who don't spend time in your district, who maybe tuned into that Senate Judiciary hearing? What do they miss in terms of perspective within your district?
Yeah, when I go, I'm always out in my areas, all of them. And when I see beautiful people who live here, who want to feel like they are safe in their neighborhoods, I see that the tide is turning. We have a lot of investment going into especially this area, with investment in food justice, in housing access, in parks, $32 million going into our parks. We have an amazing walking school bus program at Whittier and Wilson Elementary that is like going worldwide in Australia and places like Hawaii that came to find out what we're doing in District 6. Right? Because these conditions that exist that our kids are walking through are not acceptable, and we're all pushing in the same direction. And we're seeing huge dividends in crime reduction by seeing calls for service in our alleys going down now that we have neighbors taking back their alleys, and us in government just coming along with the resources that they need to do it. So I say to folks, we know what we need. We just need to start listening. And I know what my community needs, and I just need the resources. Governor, mayor, give me the resources and watch me work. We can do this.
Before you go, I know I said that was the last question, but I got one more. If you could be involved, what would a second deployment look like in your district?
Yeah, a second deployment, I would take what we're learning from other areas like Espanola. I would definitely want to focus on the harm reduction. I would definitely want to continue to focus on what other things can they do to help APD, right? But not just watching cameras and doing the perimeter. I would couple them with ACS. I would do a massive outreach, like close down the state streets. If you've driven in my district on Central, Wisconsin behind the McDonald's, Pennsylvania, Dallas, Utah, just the state streets. Let's close off between Chico and Central. Let's get some warming stations. Let's get some hygiene trailers. Let's use the National Guard's resources, because it is a disaster. It feels and looks like a disaster area. And this help me stabilize these folks and get them pathed into what the mayor has built in this network of gateways. Let's get them to these gateways and path them out, and let's see if we can clear and get folks into the appropriate bed for what they need, and get folks pathed into something different. And then again, if they don't want to take those options, then the last street is, if you have an open warrant and you don't want to get help, then the last stop on the last street is with Sheriff Allen or Chief Barker, if you don't want to make a better decision for yourself. And I think that we could see on a regular basis, but it's going to have to be both. We need both.
Understood. City Councilor Rogers, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Councilor Nicole Rogers for offering her perspective on the National Guard's time in Albuquerque. Until the 1960s, the federal government operated boarding schools that forcibly assimilated Native American children. In more recent decades, the public school system has given tribal nations little control over curriculum, and Native children have rarely seen themselves or their cultures represented in lessons. Well, enter the Indigenous Science Initiative, which aims to change that. Indigenously Positive, our collaboration with nonprofit newsroom New Mexico In Depth, kicks off its second season tonight with a look at how the initiative is working at Santa Clara Pueblo's Capo Community School. Host Bella Davis takes us into the classroom of 6th grade teacher Diane Chavarria to see how her students are learning science in a way that centers Pueblo knowledge and cultural practices.
So I think that's what native science is, like testing out the nativeness of our science. Because like before our ancestors, we were scientists. You know, we didn't get right the first time, but we got it right a couple times. You know, they asked her, the family, and like they asked her Gia, Tara, and so that means, so Gia and Tara means your mom and dad. It's a lot to take away from this, you know. You learn, hopefully you take it in your mind, take it in your heart, keep it on, you know, you just pass it on to each of your family, hoping it won't go away here. So I think
Jonathan is a 6th grader at Capo Community School in Santa Clara Pueblo, about 25 miles north of Santa Fe. His school is one of 7 across New Mexico, plus 1 in Minnesota, that are trying out a new science curriculum this school year, centered on Indigenous knowledge and learning practices. It's called the Indigenous Science Initiative.
The Indigenous Science Initiative is a collaboration between NACA Inspired Schools Network and the Lanel Foundation to work with teacher designers to develop a community-led middle grade science curriculum. There's a wealth of research now that shows that students respond to curriculum that reflects their context and their identities, and that when students feel a connection to what they're learning, whether it's a mirror or a window, they're more engaged, and they tend to achieve more as well.
Our students don't learn in compartments. Like for this hour you're doing just math, or this 45 minutes you're doing science. but they need to see how things are connected and how they're related and what those relationships are. So even though within our curriculum we have our big ideas and our core values, as you localize as a community, you can apply your core values to the work that's there and see the relationships, how they're interconnected and how they build upon each other.
When students aren't seeing themselves reflected in the curriculum, that becomes really problematic because curricular erasure really is a difficult thing for young people to try and navigate through as they're trying to be successful in schools.
Historically, education in the U.S. was a tool to violently assimilate Native children, and the system still isn't really designed for them. In 2018, a state judge found New Mexico was violating its own constitution by failing to provide a sufficient education to the majority of students in the state, including Native kids. Instead of suppressing culture, this new curriculum is meant to help students connect it with science.
All of the components of what makes a community is something that I try to bring within the classroom, and then connecting with families and connecting to the calendar of the community, of what's happening within the community, is something that I try to bring into the classroom as well, because it's very important. And to what I feel Indigenous science is it's the teachings. And it starts from their ancestors, you know, in terms of being scientists and with astronomy and with connection to the land and pottery making, the arts, all of that are examples of Indigenous science. So when I look at what we're doing, I feel like it's reinforcing a lot of what they're getting at home and within their community, but also providing that opportunity for them to have a voice.
On the day we visited, Diane's 6th grade students paired up with kindergartners for an activity. The idea was that by preparing and then baking a few different foods in an outdoor oven the whole school helped build, they'd learn about kinetic energy and the scientific method in a way they could actually connect with.
If you're you're native here, I think it's good to know about your ancestors, how they make stuff, or how they did stuff, or how did they do that, or how did they make this.
When I was growing up, we didn't have this type of interactions with our culture. Like we had Tewa language lessons, and none of this, what we're experiencing now with the KCS school. What I see is, especially with Diane, incorporating a lot of like the adobe making, today bread making, making jerky, making pottery, weaving belts. It's all hands-on and it's all tied and connected to culture.
So the community engagement work really has been an embedded part of what the Indigenous Science Initiative is doing, and it is grounded in Indigenous knowledges. It's grounded in Indigenous ways of knowing and thinking and learning, and there's this reciprocal nature that goes along with it, so that there's always a check back with the community.
Everything that I learned when I was growing up was like New Mexico history, and very little was talked about Indigenous people, and the little bit that was talked about was focused on like tribes that aren't even in this area. So like maybe the Sioux or the Comanche, or those are the two that kind of stick out in my memory, and very little on the Pueblos except for a brief touch on the Pueblo Revolt. And you know, that's not enough, and I think that if we had this type of curriculum in every school, not just Indigenous schools, but in every school, then we would be more understood. The Indigenous population will be more understood by all of the communities, or all of humanity.
One of the initiative's big plans is to make the curriculum open source later this year, meaning it'll be free to access online. The teacher designers and an advisory collective are thinking through what that could look like.
So for anyone who's accessing this in the future, we hope that they're able to see and honor and value and adapt and localize what's been created, and also see all the other great stuff that's out there and think about how that fits within their design, within their context, within their community, based on what they know about their students. We don't see this curriculum as an end-all be-all, but as a demonstration and as a starting point.
One of the biggest challenges that I think we've been trying to work through is the localization piece. And so the challenge for the teacher designers and for the advisory in some ways really is, how is it that we can make this more accessible across the board? How can we put enough front matter into the curriculum itself so that people feel comfortable and confident enough to figure out, how do you find a knowledge keeper or a knowledge sharer in the community that you're from? Because a lot of the knowledge that we're asking the students who are learning from this curriculum to engage in is based on ancestral knowledge.
There's so much knowledge within our communities, and that's one thing that I'm learning, that, and a lot of it's not within textbooks, a lot of it is oral history, a lot of it is ways that may not be openly shared with others, but making those connections where that becomes part of the curriculum, where they're able to come in and show and teach the students different important things that are important to who they are. With our Bante today, I had the students interview some of the elders or community members to talk about like what community means to them and how does food symbolize that, and reflect upon either stories or memories that relate to cooking. So they came in and they connected at home and brought those ideas as well into the classroom. So I think that there is an abundance of knowledge and just trying different ways, and usually the community will back you up, knowing that you're putting that effort in and knowing that you're on the same line that they're on.
If you don't know what Bante means, it's like an oral oven. So we call it like an outside oven. I've heard that about this oven. We've been using it for how many generations, how many years, and it's like a survival thing we use, and we use it for like our feast day, because it's just going down, passing down. Just someday I might just get to do that too. I might make one, or I'm gonna come here to do it with the kids, the other generations after me.
Thank you to Bella Davis, producer Benjamin Yaza, and our partners at New Mexico In Depth. We are so excited to have Indigenously Positive back for a second season. Thanks, of course, too, to everyone else who contributed to the show. For New Mexico PBS, I'm Nash Jones. Until next week, stay focused.
Funding for New Mexico in Focus is provided by viewers like you.